It looked harmless. A small bump on her daughter's cheek, the kind every kid gets now and then. She didn't worry, not at first. But as the days went on, that bump didn't fade. It grew, changed, and what doctors found would turn her world upside down. This is a true and emotional story of a mother's regret, courage, and the terrifying battle she never saw coming. You won't want to miss a second of it. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from by dropping a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Now let's begin. It was a Saturday afternoon in early spring when Sarah first noticed it, a tiny reddish bump just beneath her daughter Emily's left cheekbone. The sun streamed through the kitchen window as they stood at the sink together, rinsing strawberries for the pie they'd promised to make. At first glance, Sarah barely registered it. She assumed it was a pimple or maybe a bug bite. Nothing out of the ordinary. 12-year-old girls got those all the time, especially with the weather starting to shift and allergies swirling in the air. Sarah wiped her hands on a towel, glanced at the bump, and gave her daughter a quick, distracted smile. "It's just a little thing, honey. It'll go away." But Emily didn't smile back. She reached up and touched it, her fingers hovering like she was afraid to press too hard. "It hurts a little," she said quietly. "It stings when I laugh." Sarah sighed. Between her morning shifts at the diner and the late-night cleaning, jobs she'd picked up to make ends meet, she felt like she was always running on fumes. Emily was a good kid, quiet, thoughtful, never caused trouble. So when she said something hurt, Sarah listened, but only halfway. She leaned in a bit closer, squinting at the small bump. "It's nothing," she said again, brushing a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "Try not to mess with it, okay? It'll probably be gone in a couple of days." And with that, she turned back to the strawberries, her mind already racing through the grocery list and whether the rent check had cleared. Emily didn't say anything else that day, but over the next week, Sarah began to notice small changes. At first, they were easy to miss. Emily spent a little more time alone in her room. She laughed less at the sitcoms they used to watch together. And when Sarah asked how school was, Emily always gave the same flat answer: "Fine." Still, Sarah chalked it up to normal preteen mood swings. Middle school was hard. Kids were mean. Maybe her daughter was just going through a phase like she had when she was that age. Everyone said raising a daughter came with seasons of silence, but the bump didn't go away. Instead, it grew. Slowly at first, like a shadow stretching with the evening sun, then a little faster. 2 weeks after it first appeared, it looked more like a welt than a pimple. The color deepened too, reddish-purple with a slight shine to it. It sat high on Emily's cheek, right beneath the skin, and seemed to throb when she touched it. One night while they were watching television, Sarah caught Emily trying to hide it with her sleeve, pressing the fabric against her face like she could erase it. "Does it still hurt?" Sarah asked. Emily just nodded. There was a moment then, a flicker of maternal instinct that lit something in Sarah's chest, something about the way Emily looked, not just the bump, but her eyes. They had that quiet, haunted look, the kind people get when they're carrying something too heavy for too long. Sarah reached out, brushing Emily's hair back, her fingers pausing near the swelling. "Maybe we should have it looked at," she said softly, trying to sound casual. "Just to be safe." Emily hesitated. "Is it cancer?" she asked in a whisper. The words sliced through the room. Sarah blinked, taken aback. "No, honey, of course not. Where'd you hear that?" "I Googled it," Emily said, her voice small. "It said sometimes bumps that don't go away could be that." Sarah felt a cold rush under her skin. She forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. "Sweetheart, don't believe everything you read online. It's probably just a cyst or something harmless. Kids your age get all kinds of weird skin things. But okay, I'll make an appointment, just in case. Happy?" Emily nodded, but her smile never came. The next day, Sarah got distracted. Her manager called to ask if she could cover another shift. The water heater at home started leaking. The check engine light on her car blinked to life again. She told herself she'd call the clinic tomorrow, or maybe after the weekend. And then Monday came. Then Tuesday. By Wednesday, she'd forgotten about it altogether. but Emily hadn't. One evening, she quietly asked if Sarah had made the appointment yet. Her voice was careful, almost afraid. Sarah, flustered and tired, snapped without thinking. "Emily, I've got 100 things on my plate right now. It's a bump, not a broken leg. Stop obsessing over it." The hurt on Emily's face was instant. She looked down, nodded, and didn't bring it up again. Sarah felt bad, of course, but she told herself it was tough love. Kids needed to learn not to panic over every little thing. That was part of growing up. Still, that night, after Emily went to bed, Sarah stood in the bathroom, staring at her own reflection. A tired, worn-out woman looked back at her, dark circles under her eyes, wrinkles deeper than she remembered. And behind her, in the hallway mirror, she saw a sliver of her daughter's face, just for a second. That bump, now purplish and angry, catching the dim light like a warning signal. She pushed the image out of her mind and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she promised herself, tomorrow I'll call the doctor. But tomorrow came and went, and by then something far more terrifying had already begun to grow. By the following week, the bump on Emily's cheek had taken on a life of its own, a subtle but undeniable change that refused to go unnoticed. It was no longer the size of a pimple or even a swollen mosquito bite. It had become firmer, its edges more defined, and the once pinkish hue had deepened into a strange mix of purplish red with occasional streaks of yellow beneath the skin. At certain angles, especially under strong lighting, it looked like it was casting a faint shadow on her cheek. Still, Sarah, drowning in the demands of her daily life, convinced herself it wasn't urgent. She had bills piling up on the counter. Her car was long overdue for an oil change, and her manager had been threatening to cut her hours at the diner unless she picked up weekend shifts. The last thing she thought she needed was to lose a day of work sitting in a clinic waiting room over what she assumed was a stubborn blemish. When Emily gently mentioned it again, her voice soft as a breeze in a storm, Sarah responded without looking up from her phone. "It's probably hormonal," she said, scrolling through a coupon app. "All girls get these kinds of things around your age." Emily nodded, but there was a quietness in her that lingered, as if her hope had sunk a little deeper each time. Her concern was brushed aside. It wasn't just the bump anymore. It was how she'd started avoiding the mirror in the hallway, the way she tilted her face when talking to people, like she didn't want them to notice, or didn't want to notice it herself. Then came the day the school nurse called. Sarah had been balancing 2 trays of drinks at the diner when her cell phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She ducked into the back and answered, already bracing for some small disciplinary issue or maybe a stomach bug going around. But the voice on the line was calm and firm. "Mrs. Collins, I think Emily should be seen by a doctor," the nurse said gently. "That bump on her face, it's not something I feel comfortable ignoring. It's not healing the way it should. It's changed in shape and color since I first noticed it 2 weeks ago." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling heat creep up the back of her neck. She thanked the nurse and promised to handle it, but after hanging up, she told herself again it was being blown out of proportion. School nurses were always cautious. Liability reasons, probably. That night, she almost brought it up to Emily. Almost. But the girl had been quiet through dinner, poking at her macaroni, staring blankly at the television. There was something in her silence that made Sarah nervous. Not just about the bump, but about everything. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were too late to stop something, like a storm already overhead. Sarah decided not to mention the call. Maybe the nurse had overreacted. Maybe Emily would wake up tomorrow and the bump would be gone. But deep down, even as she scrubbed the dishes in the sink, she knew that wasn't going to happen. It was 2 days later, while folding laundry, that Sarah finally took a long, hard look at Emily's face in the afternoon light that filtered through the bedroom curtains. Emily had fallen asleep reading, her face turned slightly toward the window. The bump was unmistakably larger now, nearly the size of a grape, and there was a faint sheen of fluid at its center. Sarah leaned in, heart beginning to pound. She noticed the surrounding skin looked inflamed and tender, and Emily's breathing had a slight wheeze to it, as if her body was carrying more weight than it should for someone so young. Guilt, sharp and cold, rose in Sarah's chest, like a wave she couldn't hold back. She had waited too long. She had told herself it was nothing because she didn't want it to be something. Later that evening, she sat on the porch steps with her coffee going cold in her hands, staring at the mailbox like it might deliver an answer. She thought of all the time she'd said not now, tomorrow, we'll see. And now, all those tomorrows felt like excuses. Emily was just a kid. It was her job to protect her, to notice, to act. And what had she done? Worked double shifts, fought off exhaustion, with caffeine and denial, and let her daughter suffer in silence. She thought of the way Emily's eyes had looked the last time she brought it up. Dimmed, like she had finally stopped expecting her mother to care. That image wouldn't let go. The next morning, Sarah called the clinic. The receptionist gave her the earliest appointment, 5 days away. Too long, she thought, but better than nothing. She marked it on the calendar with a red pen. That same afternoon, Emily came home from school and quietly placed a note on the kitchen table. It was from her friend Lily's mother. Sarah unfolded the note, her hands trembling slightly. It read, "I'm worried about Emily, that bump on her cheek. It's not normal. Please take her to a doctor." Sarah stared at the paper for a long time, the words blurring. It was the third voice in a growing chorus that had tried to wake her up, and maybe it was the one she needed to finally hear. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Then she walked into Emily's room, sat on the edge of the bed and brushed her daughter's hair behind her ear. "We're going to the doctor," she said softly. "I should have listened sooner. I'm sorry." Emily nodded without speaking, but she reached for her mother's hand and held it. Her touch was warm, fragile. Sarah squeezed it gently, realizing this wasn't just about the bump anymore. It was about trust, and she had almost let it slip through her fingers. By the time the clinic appointment finally arrived, the spring sunshine had turned sharp, and Emily had changed in more ways than Sarah could explain. It wasn't just the swelling on her cheek, which now looked angry and swollen, the skin stretched, and glistening like something under pressure. It was something deeper, something quieter, but far more unsettling. Emily had withdrawn into herself like a flower closing against the cold. She no longer played the piano in the evenings like she used to, no longer hummed along with the music in the grocery store, and didn't complain about vegetables on her plate. She was quieter at school, her teachers said, more distracted. Her friends stopped coming by. Even Lily, the one who had slipped Sarah the note, hadn't been around for days. Sarah noticed it all, every detail, and yet still felt powerless, like the mother she was trying to be had fallen 3 steps behind, the daughter who needed her. They sat in the clinic waiting room with the kind of silence that feels too heavy to break. Sarah filled out the clipboard with shaky hands while Emily sat beside her, face turned away from the room, from the other children, from everything. The nurse called them in, and the doctor, a young man with a calm voice and tired eyes, examined the bump with professional thoroughness. He prodded it gently while Emily flinched, then turned to Sarah with that look, curious but unreadable. "How long has this been here?" he asked. "About 3 weeks," Sarah said, her voice low. The doctor nodded, then asked a string of questions. Any history of infections, allergies, insect bites, chronic illness, skin conditions? Sarah answered them all, feeling like each one was a quiet accusation. When he was finished, he scribbled something in the chart and told them he'd like to run a few tests. "It's probably nothing," he said, but he didn't look convinced. "I want to rule out a couple of things." They drew blood. They took a swab of fluid from the swelling. They scheduled a follow-up, and then they sent them home, just like that. Sarah tried to act calm on the way back to the car, but inside her, fear had begun to form a shape. It wasn't panic yet, but it had roots. In the rearview mirror, she watched Emily touch her cheek gently, like someone might touch a bruise that doesn't go away. "Do you think it's serious?" Emily asked. "No," Sarah lied. "They're just being careful." Over the next few days, things shifted even more. Emily started sleeping longer, sometimes coming home from school and going straight to bed. She'd missed 2 assignments, her teacher emailed, and Sarah had to explain that they'd been to the doctor, that Emily wasn't feeling well, and they were waiting for test results. Every time her phone rang, Sarah jumped. She kept the clinic number saved and checked her voicemail twice a day. Still nothing. But the bump had changed again. Now it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a slow heartbeat beneath the skin, and Sarah began to wonder if it had grown deeper than she could see. On a Thursday afternoon, Emily fainted in the kitchen. One second she was reaching for a glass, the next she was on the floor, the sound of it loud and terrifying in the quiet house. Sarah rushed to her, heart racing, hands trembling as she called her name. Emily stirred slowly, her eyelids fluttering. "I just got dizzy," she whispered. But Sarah didn't wait. She bundled Emily into the car and drove straight to the emergency room, no appointments, no hesitations. Whatever this was, it was not nothing anymore. This was something, and it was taking her daughter piece by piece. In the ER, they were rushed faster than Sarah expected. Doctors asked more questions, checked vitals, and within an hour, Emily was lying in a hospital bed hooked up to monitors. A specialist came in, a woman with kind but serious eyes, who took one long look at Emily's cheek and ordered an MRI. Sarah waited alone while Emily was taken for imaging, her hands folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles ached. She stared at the floor and tried to remember the last time she had felt truly in control of anything. When the results came back, the room shifted. The doctor didn't sit. She stood beside the chart, her voice steady. "There's a mass," she said, "under the surface, pressing against muscle tissue. It may be connected to lymph nodes in the face and neck. It's not behaving like a typical cyst. We need to biopsy it immediately." Sarah felt the blood leave her face. "Are you saying—" She couldn't finish. The doctor paused. "We're not sure yet. But we need to find out. Quickly." Emily had fallen asleep again by the time Sarah returned to her bedside. The soft beeping of machines filled the air, and outside the window the sky had turned a gentle lavender with the evening. Sarah reached for her daughter's hand, small and pale, and held it tightly. She had brushed aside the signs for too long, dismissed the warnings because they didn't fit into her frantic life. But now everything had come into focus, sharp and clear and terrifying. The bump was no longer just a bump. It had become the center of a storm she could no longer ignore. The day of the biopsy arrived with a heaviness Sarah could feel deep in her bones, like the air itself was thicker than usual, harder to breathe. Emily lay in the sterile hospital bed, dressed in a pale blue gown that seemed too large for her suddenly fragile frame. Her eyes were tired but calm, far calmer than Sarah's own hands, which trembled every time she adjusted the thin blanket over Emily's legs. A nurse came in, her voice gentle, explaining the steps ahead, the anesthesia, the incision, the recovery time. Sarah nodded at all the right moments, but the words floated in and out like fragments of a dream she didn't want to be part of. What haunted her most wasn't just the procedure or even the word mass. It was the unspoken fear behind the doctor's tone, the way she avoided the word tumor, like it might make things worse simply by being said out loud. They wheeled Emily down the hallway, and Sarah followed as far as they let her, stopping at the line marked "Staff Only." Emily looked back just before the doors swung shut and gave her mother a small smile. That smile clung to Sarah's heart like a prayer. She found herself in the waiting room again. The same pale chairs and humming vending machines, but now everything felt different, more brittle. The minutes crawled by, and every time a nurse walked through the door, Sarah's body tensed in expectation. After what felt like forever, a man in scrubs appeared and called her name. The biopsy was done. Emily was in recovery. She was okay. But the words didn't calm her. They only made her more aware of what came next. Waiting. The doctor had said. The results would take a few days. Days. As if time wasn't already pressing down like a weight. Back at home, Sarah tried to return things to normal. She made Emily's favorite soup, fluffed the pillows on the couch, and even brought out an old board game they hadn't touched in years. Emily played along, moved her pieces, even laughed once or twice. but her energy faded quickly, and within the hour, she was curled up with her head against her mother's shoulder, fast asleep. Sarah didn't move. She just sat there, listening to the soft sound of her daughter's breathing, wondering what news was being formed in some sterile lab far away, what words were being typed into a report that could change everything. She barely slept that night, and when the phone finally rang 3 days later, she felt her stomach twist into a knot so tight she almost couldn't answer. The doctor's voice was steady, professional. She asked if Sarah had time to talk, if she was in a private place. Sarah walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind her. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the comforter like a rope. "We have the results," the doctor said. There was a pause. "The mass is abnormal. The pathology indicates that it is a form of soft tissue sarcoma, a rare kind of cancer. It's aggressive but treatable. We'll need to act quickly. I've already scheduled a consult with the pediatric oncology team. They'll explain the next steps, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. It was as though the world had tilted and nothing made sense. Cancer. The word echoed in her ears, loud and final. She pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to keep from crying out. The doctor kept talking, something about treatment plans, timelines, referrals, but Sarah couldn't follow. All she could think was that her little girl, her baby, had cancer. When the call ended, she sat in silence, the room impossibly still. Then, as if on cue, Emily called from the living room. "Mom?" Her voice was soft, curious, not frightened yet. Sarah wiped her face quickly and walked out with the bravest smile she could manage. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said, sitting beside her. Emily looked up at her and tilted her head. "Was that the doctor?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said slowly. "They found out what the bump is. It's something called sarcoma. It means we'll need to see some special doctors and go through some treatments to get rid of it. But they know what it is now, and that's good. Knowing is the first step to healing." Emily blinked, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "So it's cancer?" The word felt like a knife, but Sarah nodded. "Yes, but we're going to fight it together. Every step." Emily didn't cry. She just leaned against her mother's shoulder again and whispered, "Okay." And in that small word, Sarah heard all the bravery in the world. Later that night, after Emily had gone to sleep, Sarah stood by her window, staring out at the streetlights. She thought about all the moments she had taken for granted. School lunches, bedtime kisses, the way Emily used to dance in the kitchen while brushing her teeth. She would fight for those moments now, every single one. She would fight for more, tomorrows, for more laughter, for a future that didn't have to end in whispers and hospital beds. She didn't know how the road ahead would unfold, but she knew one thing with all her heart. She would not let this illness define her daughter's story. She would not let fear write the ending. The oncology wing of the Children's Hospital was a place Sarah never imagined she'd have to know so intimately. The walls were painted with bright murals of animals and stars, a desperate attempt to disguise the harshness of reality with cheer. But behind the laughter of cartoons and the cheerful wallpaper, there was a quiet tension that hovered in every hallway. It was a place where hope and fear sat side by side, where every parent walked a tightrope between pretending everything would be fine and preparing for the worst. Emily clutched Sarah's hand as they entered the consultation room, her fingers smaller than Sarah remembered. Or maybe they just felt smaller now that everything else had become so big. Dr. Lynn, the pediatric oncologist, was a composed woman, in her early 40s, with a softness in her voice that somehow made even the hardest truths feel slightly easier to hear. She explained everything carefully, drawing diagrams as she spoke. The sarcoma was rare but not unheard of. It had formed deep in Emily's facial tissue and appeared to have begun spreading toward nearby lymph nodes. The recommended course of action was aggressive, a combination of chemotherapy to shrink the tumor, followed by surgery, and then radiation if necessary. Sarah sat stiffly, absorbing every word while trying to stay focused. But the words, chemo, surgery, side effects, felt like darts aimed straight at her heart. Emily asked only one question. "Will I lose my hair?" Dr. Lin hesitated just long enough for the answer to feel heavy. Yes, she said gently. You probably will for a while, but it will grow back. And more importantly, you'll still be you. Just braver. Emily nodded quietly, as if that were the only confirmation she needed. Sarah wanted to weep at that, at her daughter's silent strength, but she held it in. She had promised herself not to cry in front of Emily. Not anymore. Not unless it was tears of victory. The next day, they returned for Emily's first round of chemotherapy. The nurses were kind and efficient, explaining the procedure step by step. But the sight of the IV needle sliding into Emily's arm broke something inside Sarah. She held her daughter's other hand the whole time, whispering stories, reminding her of the time they got caught in a rainstorm at the farmer's market and had to run barefoot through puddles. Emily smiled faintly, but she was exhausted by the end of it. That night, Sarah helped her into bed, tucking her in gently, smoothing her hair away from her damp forehead. "Mom," Emily whispered before falling asleep. "I don't want to." "Be strong every day." Sarah kissed her temple. "You don't have to be. You just have to be loved. I'll carry the rest." The following weeks became a blur of hospital visits, blood tests, nausea, and quiet resilience. Sarah adjusted her work schedule, took unpaid leave, canceled bills, dipped into savings she never thought she'd need this way. Friends dropped off meals and offered kind words, but most didn't know what to say, and some drifted away. The world kept spinning, but Sarah and Emily lived in a smaller orbit now, one defined by appointments and lab results and waiting rooms. Emily lost her appetite, then her hair, then some of the spark in her eyes, but never her will. She still asked to watch her favorite cartoons. She still doodled on the backs of clinic forms. And sometimes, when she had enough strength, she still played piano with trembling fingers, the melody soft and sweet. One evening, after a particularly rough treatment day, Sarah found herself sitting on the edge of the bathtub while Emily vomited beside her. Her daughter's face was pale and drawn, and she trembled from exhaustion. When it was finally over, Sarah helped her rinse her mouth, then lifted her carefully to her feet. "It's okay," Sarah whispered. "We're going to get through this." Emily leaned her head against her mother's chest and said nothing. But in that silence, Sarah heard something deeper than words. A quiet understanding. A kind of trust that only pain can forge. As the first month passed, the doctors noticed a small improvement. The tumor had reduced slightly in size. It wasn't dramatic, but it was something. Sarah clung to that hope like a life raft, holding it tightly even when the nights were long and full of doubt. She began keeping a notebook of every question, every symptom, every tiny progress note. It became her weapon in the battle, her way of staying informed, involved, in control. Emily would sometimes tease her about it. "You're becoming a doctor," she'd say with a smile. "Well," Sarah would reply, "I did always like bossing doctors around." But beneath the laughter, Sarah knew they were still walking a narrow bridge. The side effects were accumulating. Emily had begun experiencing sharp pain in her jaw and temple, and a new scan showed some inflammation that hadn't been there before. The doctors weren't alarmed yet, but they were cautious. Another biopsy was scheduled. Sarah didn't say anything, but she could feel her hope wavering, trembling under the weight of constant worry. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours in a row in weeks. Still, she never missed a single appointment. She never let go of Emily's hand. She smiled when she needed to, cried only in private, and whispered prayers into her daughter's hair every night. The fight had truly begun. And Sarah knew there was no turning back, no room for fear, only forward, only love. Autumn had begun to cast its quiet golden light across the streets of their small suburban town, but inside the hospital room where Emily lay curled beneath a fleece blanket, there was no sense of season. The air smelled of antiseptic and metal, and time seemed measured not by days or weather, but by IV drips and test results. Sarah sat beside her daughter as always, her hand gently rubbing small circles on Emily's back, hoping the motion brought more comfort than her words could. The last few weeks had been harder than the ones before. The side effects of chemotherapy had grown harsher, more unrelenting. Emily had developed mouth sores that made eating excruciating, and a persistent fever had refused to break. Her laughter, once soft and frequent, had grown rare, but what worried Sarah most wasn't what she could see. It was what the doctors couldn't fully explain. The inflammation in Emily's jaw had worsened, and though preliminary scans showed the tumor hadn't grown back, a new shadow had appeared near her ear. No one used the word metastasis yet, but Sarah could see the concern in their eyes, even when they tried to mask it with gentle tones and half smiles. The second biopsy had left Emily even weaker. This time she didn't bounce back after a day or two. Her energy stayed low, her eyes dim. Sarah tried everything, brought in her favorite books, the soft bunny she'd had since she was 4, even old home videos on her phone. But Emily often just turned her face to the wall and slept. The silence was the hardest part. Sarah longed for the girl who once asked endless questions, who made silly jokes about her IV pole, calling it Mr. Stick. Now, even Mr. Stick stood untouched in the corner, and Sarah found herself whispering into the night, as if the quiet would answer back. "Please," she would say, "not yet, not my baby, not now." Then came the night that Sarah would never forget. Emily had been pale all day, her breathing shallow, her skin damp. A nurse noticed her oxygen levels had dropped, and within minutes, a team of doctors was in the room, moving with quiet urgency. Sarah was ushered back, forced to watch as they fitted her daughter with an oxygen mask and adjusted monitors that beeped with unsteady rhythm. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with nothing beneath her. After what felt like hours, the lead physician pulled Sarah aside. Emily had developed an infection, possibly sepsis. Her immune system, weakened by the chemo, was struggling to fight it off. They would be transferring her to the ICU for closer monitoring. Sarah nodded numbly, her legs barely holding her upright. When they wheeled Emily out, she followed like a ghost, her mind unable to process anything except the primal fear pulsing through her veins. The ICU was colder, quieter, more serious. Machines clicked and hissed around Emily, now hooked up to multiple lines, her face more fragile than Sarah had ever seen it. That night, Sarah sat by her daughter's bed and did something she hadn't allowed herself to do in weeks. She broke. She cried with her head on Emily's mattress, her fingers gripping the edge as if holding on could keep her daughter tethered to the world. All the strength she had summoned, all the brave faces and reassuring smiles, crumbled into a mother's raw grief. She whispered apologies for not seeing the bump sooner, for dismissing it as nothing. She begged whatever higher power might be listening to give her a second chance. To give Emily a second chance. Somewhere between sobs and silence, her daughter stirred. "Mom?" The voice was raspy, barely there. Sarah lifted her head, wiping her face quickly. "I'm here, sweetheart." Emily's eyelids fluttered open. "Just a bit." "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to be strong all the time." And in that moment, Sarah felt something shift, not the fear. That was still there. But the understanding that this fight wasn't one she had to carry alone. Her daughter, even in this weakened state, was still reaching for her, still reminding her that love was not just about protection, it was about presence. The next morning, the antibiotics began to take hold. Slowly, Emily's fever started to come down. The infection responded, and her oxygen levels improved. She was moved out of ICU by the end of the week, still weak, but no longer in immediate danger. The relief that swept through Sarah was so great she cried again, but this time with gratitude. She thanked every nurse, every doctor, even the janitor, who smiled kindly as he mopped the hallway outside Emily's room. Life, she realized, had narrowed to moments. Each hour without pain, each smile from Emily, each quiet breath, these were the victories now. The following week, Dr. Lin delivered the results of the second biopsy. The new shadow wasn't a metastasis. It was a fluid buildup caused by the tumor's response to treatment. Not ideal, but not dire. They would adjust her chemo regimen and continue monitoring closely. Sarah felt something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Relief with no strings. It was a reprieve, not an escape, but it was enough. That night, Emily asked if she could try walking to the end of the hallway. She hadn't walked in days, but she wanted to try. With Sarah on one side and a nurse on the other, she stood slowly and took her first shaky step. Then another. Each movement was slow, labored, but determined. By the time she reached the window at the end of the hall, the late afternoon sun was casting gold across the linoleum. Emily stood there for a moment, her face bathed in light, her hand resting on the glass. "Look," she said softly. Fall came. Sarah smiled through tears. Yes, it did. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, they stood there, together, facing the light, choosing to believe that tomorrow would still be theirs to claim. The quiet after the storm always feels the heaviest. Though Emily had come back from the brink, Sarah knew their journey was far from over. Every positive update was now filtered through a lens of cautious hope. The doctors had revised her treatment. Yes, but they still spoke in guarded terms. Words like monitor and response and best-case scenario clung to Sarah's thoughts long after she left the hospital each evening. There was no promise, only possibility, and that fragile uncertainty was no longer something she could live with passively. She needed to do more. Waiting wasn't enough anymore. So she began to search. Not just the pamphlets at the hospital or the short conversations in hallways. She dove deep into every corner of the internet, reading medical journals, watching Survivor, testimonials, and joining late-night forums full of other parents with haunted eyes and trembling hands. There was an entire world of people like her out there, people walking through the same shadows, and in their stories she found flickers of light. One night, after Emily had fallen asleep and the nurses promised to keep a close eye on her, Sarah drove home in silence and sat in the kitchen until dawn with her laptop open and her heart racing. That was the night she discovered an experimental immunotherapy trial being conducted at a children's hospital 3 states away. The early data was promising, especially for pediatric sarcomas that hadn't fully responded to chemotherapy. She reached out immediately, filling out the inquiry form, attaching Emily's medical records, and writing a letter so full of pleading hope that her hands shook as she typed. Days passed without word. Then finally, an email. The lead investigator was willing to speak to her. A video call was arranged, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she was stepping forward, not merely treading water. The doctor on the screen was kind but direct. Emily's case was borderline eligible. The treatment wasn't FDA approved yet, and there were risks, unknowns that came with every clinical trial. But if they were willing, and Emily's oncologist agreed to coordinate with their team, they could explore the option. Sarah printed out everything, highlighted notes, and scheduled a meeting with Dr. Lin. She had braced herself for resistance, expecting bureaucracy or skepticism. But what she received instead was something far more complicated. Dr. Lin was thoughtful, respectful, and honest. She explained that while immunotherapy had shown incredible promise, it was not without failures. Emily's body was already vulnerable. Introducing an unproven therapy could either help her tremendously or push her past her limit. Still, she didn't say no. She promised to review the trial's data, consult with the research team, and bring it before the hospital's ethics board. That evening, Sarah sat at Emily's bedside and watched her sleep. Her daughter's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a child who had no idea how many decisions were being made on her behalf. The following week became a blur of discussions and paperwork. Sarah found herself speaking in a new language of immune responses, T cells, and cytokine storms. Words she'd never imagined learning but now clung to like lifelines. She felt like she was becoming someone else entirely, someone both mother and medical advocate, someone who asked hard questions and refused easy answers. Emily's strength, though still flickering, returned slowly. She was able to sit up more often, eat small bites of food without grimacing, even smile a little when Sarah played her favorite songs. One afternoon, Sarah brought up the possibility of the new treatment. She didn't want to overwhelm her, but she believed Emily deserved to know. "So," Emily said quietly, "it's like giving my body new soldiers." Sarah smiled, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Exactly. Like that. Smarter soldiers who know how to fight the tumor better." Emily thought for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. "Okay, let's give them a shot." With that, the path was clear, or at least clearer. Arrangements were made for a preliminary evaluation out of state. The trip would be difficult. Emily couldn't handle long drives, so Sarah coordinated a medical transport flight funded partially by a pediatric cancer foundation she had contacted weeks earlier. Everything was moving, fast and fragile, like glass wheels on an icy road. But Sarah no longer felt paralyzed by fear. She had a direction. She had something that felt dangerously close to hope. As the date approached, Sarah stood in her kitchen, packing a small duffel bag, Emily's favorite hoodie, her sketchbook, a few pictures from home. She paused, staring at the framed photo of Emily from 2 summers ago at the beach, her hair wild in the wind, a popsicle dripping down her wrist. She touched the glass gently. "We're going to get you back," she whispered. The night before the trip, Sarah sat in the hospital chair holding Emily's hand. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, soft and slow, dusting the parking. Lot lights in quiet white. Emily looked out at it and smiled. "Do you think it's snowing there too?" Sarah followed her gaze. "Maybe, but I think tomorrow we'll find out for ourselves." Emily turned to her mother and said, "Thank you for not giving up." Sarah kissed the back of her daughter's hand and replied, "That was never an option." The morning of the flight arrived with a stillness that made everything feel both surreal and sacred. Sarah had barely slept, lying awake beside Emily in the hospital room, watching her daughter's delicate chest rise and fall as though memorizing the pattern. The transport team arrived just before dawn, gentle and efficient, their voices soft but firm, like they knew the fragility of what they were carrying. Emily was quiet but alert, her eyes curious as they wheeled her into the ambulance that would take them to the airport. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, worn with age and affection, and Sarah held her hand the entire ride, her thumb tracing small, soothing circles into Emily's palm as the city slowly passed them by. The hospital faded in the rearview mirror, and with it, the routine that had become their unwanted second home. Everything ahead was new, uncertain, and terrifyingly hopeful. The flight was smooth, though Sarah's nerves were anything but. She spent most of it staring out the window, one arm around Emily's shoulders, trying to imagine what would happen next, what the new doctors would say, how Emily's body would respond. There were no guarantees. This wasn't a miracle cure with polished outcomes and neat statistics. It was a leap, a risk, but one that came with even the slightest chance of a real fight, of something that could work where everything else had failed. And that made it worth every fear that crept into her heart. They landed in the late morning and were transported directly to the Children's Hospital. It was smaller than their home hospital but carried an air of quiet innovation, the walls filled with bright murals and soft music, nurses who smiled with their eyes and spoke with sincerity that soothed Sarah's weary soul. Emily was settled into her new room, and within an hour, the new team began their assessments. Blood draws, imaging, immune profiling. Everything felt faster, sharper, like a team running toward a fire with the belief they could actually extinguish it. Dr. Halber, the lead investigator of the immunotherapy trial, came in that afternoon. She was younger than Sarah had expected, with a calm confidence that radiated through every word she spoke. She explained the treatment protocol, the timelines, the markers they'd monitor, the possible side effects, some mild, some alarming. She didn't sugarcoat anything, and for that, Sarah felt a quiet respect bloom in her chest. Emily listened, nodding slowly, asking a few questions in her thin but clear voice. At the end of the explanation, Dr. Halber looked at them both and said, "We don't have certainty, but we have a chance. If you're ready, we'll begin tomorrow." Sarah looked to Emily, who reached out for her mother's hand and squeezed. "I want to try," she whispered, and with that, it was decided. No turning back. That evening, Sarah stepped outside for the first time since their arrival, standing beneath the pale gray sky, letting the wind sting her cheeks as though to remind her she was still standing. She called her sister, updating her with everything, and then just stood there in silence, listening to the distant sounds of cars, of life going on around them. She had never felt so distant from the rest of the world, and yet so deeply connected to this one small corner where her daughter fought for her life. The next day began early. Emily received a pre-treatment cocktail to prepare her immune system. Then, the infusion began. The modified cells, designed to recognize and attack the cancer, entered her bloodstream through a slow drip, silent and unseen, yet potentially life-altering. Sarah watched the monitor, watched the steady flow, and tried to ignore the racing of her own heart. Emily dozed through most of it, the medicine making her drowsy. The nurses checked her vitals constantly, charting every change. Hours passed. The room was filled with quiet tension, like everyone was holding their breath together. The first night after the treatment was hard. Emily developed a low-grade fever and complained of body aches. Dr. Halber assured them it was a common response, a sign that the immune system was reacting. But by midnight, the fever spiked, and Emily became confused, murmuring things that didn't make sense. Panic surged through Sarah as the team moved quickly, cooling her body, adjusting medications, drawing blood. It was the longest night of Sarah's life. She sat by the bed, clutching Emily's hand, whispering over and over, "You're okay, baby. You're okay. I'm right here." By morning, the fever broke. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her voice small and scratchy. "Did it work?" she asked. Sarah leaned down, kissed her forehead, and said, "It's working, sweetheart. Your soldiers are fighting." Over the next week, Emily's vitals stabilized. Blood work began showing early markers that the treatment was having an effect. The tumors weren't gone, not yet, but signs pointed toward activity. Her immune system had launched an attack. For the first time in months, the doctors used the word encouraging. Sarah didn't allow herself to celebrate just yet, but every time Emily smiled, every time she sat up on her own or asked for a story or hummed along to the song Sarah played on her phone, she felt something lift from her shoulders. They had taken the risk, and somehow it hadn't shattered them. In fact, it might just be saving them. For days, the hospital room was filled with quiet hope, the kind that tiptoes in like morning light after a storm. Sarah watched the numbers on the monitors like a hawk, learned to decipher every beep and chart, holding her breath whenever the nurses whispered in corners or when the doctor hesitated for even a second. She tried to measure progress in teaspoons rather than gallons, a longer nap, a smile that reached Emily's tired eyes, a laugh that didn't end in a coughing fit. These small moments became anchors. Then, on the 7th day post-infusion, the doctor walked in with a look Sarah hadn't seen in a long time, cautious optimism. Dr. Halber held up a scan, the image grainy and gray, and pointed at the areas that had once been tumors. "They're shrinking," she said quietly. "The treatment is working." Sarah stared at the image, then at her daughter, asleep in the hospital bed with her head tilted toward the window, her lashes long against pale skin. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears welled up without permission. It wasn't just working. It was truly, visibly making a difference. The tumors were shrinking. She didn't cry out of relief alone, but from months of fear unwinding all that. Once from the feeling of holding a rope in the dark and finally hearing someone shout from the other end. The days that followed were still filled with ups and downs. Emily had days where she had no energy to sit up, where nausea from the treatment hit hard, and where rashes and headaches reminded everyone that this battle was still far from over. But every low was now met with a counterbalance. A rising white cell count, improved oxygen levels, clearer speech. Each night, Sarah leaned against the armchair near Emily's bed and whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force in the universe had led them here. The hospital staff began to smile more openly when they entered the room. The nutritionist brought back foods Emily had long stopped asking for. Sarah even caught the nurse humming one of the lullabies she often played on her phone as though joy had returned like a cautious guest, waiting to be invited fully in. Then came the day Emily asked if she could walk again. It was such a simple sentence, spoken without drama, that Sarah paused mid-sentence before replying. "You want to try?" she asked gently, afraid of offering too much hope too fast. Emily nodded, and so they did. With help from 2 nurses and a physical therapist, Emily stood. Her legs trembled, and her breaths came fast, but she stood. Sarah clutched the arm of the chair and watched as her daughter took one careful, trembling step, then another. She didn't walk across the room, but she walked enough. Enough to make Sarah weep openly, sobs racking her body as joy and disbelief fought for space in her heart. That evening, the sunset outside their window burned orange and pink, streaks of light painting the sky like the world itself was celebrating. Emily asked Sarah to open the window, just a crack, and they listened to the sound of the wind, cars, laughter in the distance. "Do you think I'll go home soon?" Emily asked. Sarah's voice caught in her throat. "Maybe," she whispered. Maybe soon. That night, as Emily drifted into sleep, Sarah sat beside her bed, fingers tangled in her daughter's hair, and allowed herself a moment she hadn't dared dream of, visualizing them leaving the hospital, returning to their home, decorating. For holidays, baking cookies, doing homework, living. Just living. It felt so close now, like the outline of a door appearing in a wall she once believed was solid stone. But with hope came fear, too. Sarah knew better than to let herself relax completely. The doctors warned them that relapses could happen, that the treatment's success would only be confirmed over time, through continued scans and blood work. But this turning point was undeniable. Emily's strength was growing. Her body was responding. The impossible was no longer out of reach. One afternoon, while Emily was napping, Dr. Halber came by again, this time holding another set of scans. She laid them down and spoke with that same steady, compassionate voice. "I wanted to show you this personally," she said. "These images are from this morning. The largest tumor is now half its original size, and the others nearly invisible. We believe your daughter is entering remission." Sarah stared at the words, "entering remission," as if they were written in light. Her knees felt weak. She had heard the term before, knew what it meant, but never dared to apply it to her own child. How long until we can be sure?" she asked, her voice cracking. "We'll keep monitoring," Dr. Halber said gently. "But this is extraordinary." That evening, Sarah didn't tell Emily right away. She sat with the news, held it like a fragile egg in her hands, unsure how or when to share it. But as Emily played a card game with the nurse and laughed softly over losing, Sarah knew the time had come. "Sweetheart," she said, sitting beside her, "the doctor says you're getting better. Really better. The tumors, they're almost gone." Emily blinked, setting her cards down slowly. "So I'm going to live?" she asked in a whisper. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Emily threw her arms around her mother's neck and held tight. For the first time in a very long time, Sarah allowed herself to believe they had made it to the other side of the storm. The hospital discharge papers felt surreal in Sarah's hands, like some kind of miracle spelled out in medical terms and official stamps. She held them with the same reverence one might offer a love letter or a long-lost photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as if afraid the paper would disappear if she gripped it too tightly. Emily sat in the wheelchair beside her, her eyes half closed from fatigue but glowing with a quiet excitement. She wore a pale green hoodie and sweatpants, her hair tied in a soft braid that Sarah had combed gently that morning. The nurses came to hug them one by one, each smile wet with emotion, each goodbye tinged with disbelief. They had watched this girl teeter on the edge of life, and now she was going home. Not to die, to live. The drive back felt both too fast and not fast enough. Sarah's hands clutched the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather, while Emily stared out the window with a stillness that suggested she was trying to relearn the world outside of hospital walls. The town looked the same but different. The sidewalks, once so familiar, now seemed impossibly wide. The trees were greener than she remembered. Every house felt like a postcard. Sarah glanced over at her daughter and caught her wiping away a quiet tear. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Emily nodded but didn't speak. They didn't need words in that moment. They had learned to read each other in silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Sarah almost expected to see something different waiting for them, like the house itself would have somehow transformed to reflect the journey they'd been on. But it stood exactly as they'd left it, red brick, white trim, the porch swing creaking gently in the breeze. Sarah helped Emily out of the car, careful to move slowly, and the two of them walked toward the front door like survivors returning to a life paused long ago. Inside, the scent of lavender and old wood filled the air, a comforting blend that instantly reminded Emily of childhood. The living room was cozy, the blankets folded neatly, the family photos still lining the mantel. Everything was familiar. And yet, everything had changed. The first few days at home were a mix of joy and adjustment. Sarah found herself waking at odd hours, still expecting the sound of machines or the distant murmur of nurses. Emily, though glad to be home, moved slowly, her body still fragile, her stamina limited. But there was something else too, a kind of quiet purpose in the way she approached each day. She insisted on walking from her bed to the kitchen every morning, no matter how tired she felt. She asked to water the plants by the windowsill. She even tried to make toast one morning, and though she dropped the bread and nearly burned it, she laughed, a real laugh that filled the kitchen with music. One afternoon, they sat together in the backyard, the sun warming their faces, a gentle breeze playing with Emily's hair. She turned to Sarah and said, "I want to go back to school eventually, not right away, but I want to finish high school, maybe even college. I want to be a pediatric nurse." Sarah felt something catch in her chest. "A nurse?" Emily nodded. "The way they helped me. I want to do that for someone else. Someone scared. Someone who thinks they're not going to make it. I want to be there and say, 'You will.'" Sarah couldn't stop the tears. She reached over and took her daughter's hand, kissed the knuckles one by one, and whispered, "You're already someone's miracle, Emily." As weeks passed, the house began to echo with normal sounds again. The hum of the washing machine, the clang of dishes in the sink, the soft strum of music from Emily's room. And yet, every sound now carried weight. Each noise was a reminder of life continuing, of time moving forward. Emily's appetite returned slowly, and Sarah celebrated every bowl of soup finished, every slice of apple eaten. Her daughter's laughter became a daily reward, her smile a sunrise that never failed. But amid the light, Sarah sometimes felt shadows creeping in. The fear wasn't gone. It lingered in the background, like a ghost she couldn't banish, whispering questions she dared not say aloud. What if the cancer came back? What if this peace was only temporary? One night, unable to sleep, Sarah found herself standing in the doorway of Emily's room. Her daughter lay asleep, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her face peaceful. On the nightstand sat a notebook, Emily's journal. Sarah would never dream of reading it, but its presence alone told her something vital. Emily had hope again. She was dreaming of a future, and that, more than any test result, was a sign of healing. The next morning, Emily showed Sarah a list she had made, my second chance list. It included things like learn to dance, go to New York, try sushi, adopt a rescue dog, and thank every nurse by name. Sarah smiled through tears as she read each item, her heart full. They would do them all. Together. They started small. A trip to the park, a movie night on the couch, a visit to the local animal shelter where Emily fell in love with a scruffy mutt she named Chance. They hung a chalkboard in the kitchen to check off each new adventure. Emily's list became a source of joy and a way to mark how far they had come. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house echoed not with grief, but with laughter, with music, with plans, with life. And in those echoes, Sarah realized they were writing a new chapter, one not defined by illness, but by resilience, by the simple, profound beauty of a second chance. One quiet Sunday morning, Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out the coffee pot, while the birds chirped cheerfully just beyond the window screen. The air was light with the scent of early summer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her shoulders weren't so tight with fear. Emily had been home for nearly a month, and life had begun to stitch itself back together. The list on the chalkboard was filling up with check marks, and Chance, their scrappy new dog, had brought an untamed joy into the house that no one realized they needed. As Sarah turned to wipe down the counter, she noticed Emily's journal, resting on the table beside a half-eaten bowl of cereal. It was closed, a pink ribbon marking the last page. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had never once violated her daughter's privacy, not even during the most harrowing moments at the hospital. But something stirred in her, a gentle nudge in the back of her mind, like an instinct too quiet to explain. Emily was outside in the backyard with Chance. Sarah reached for the journal with careful fingers. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat down, holding it like it might start speaking to her if she waited long enough. Her thumb brushed the ribbon. Then, almost as if guided by something greater than herself, she flipped to a page near the middle, not marked, not hidden, just waiting. The handwriting was Emily's, neat but emotionally raw, as though the words had been poured straight from her soul. Sarah began to read. At first it was what she expected. A record of hospital days, descriptions of pain, fear, dreams that seemed impossible. But then, as she turned to another entry, something different emerged. It was a letter, written, as if to her but never given. "Mom," the page began, "if you're ever reading this, something must have happened. Maybe I gave it to you. Maybe I didn't make it, and someone else found it. Either way, you need to know the truth. I haven't been entirely honest. I didn't just wake up one morning with a bump on my cheek. It started earlier. I noticed it months ago. But I was scared. I thought maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. I didn't want to worry you. I saw how tired you already were, working double shifts, always stressed. I thought maybe I could protect you from one more thing. I know now how wrong that was." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the journal tighter, reading faster as her eyes welled up. There were signs. The headaches, the nosebleeds, the weird, dizzy spells. I pretended they were nothing. I was so afraid. And then when the bump came, I knew it wasn't nothing anymore. But I still didn't tell you. I thought if I just smiled hard enough, stayed strong enough, it would all go away. I kept telling myself I could handle it, that you didn't need another burden, that maybe I wasn't brave enough to face what was really going on. But Mom, the worst part is, I think I was ashamed that something could be wrong with me." Sarah pressed the journal to her chest, as though holding it closer could take away the ache blooming inside her. She remembered those early days, the subtle signs she had brushed off, the way Emily rubbed her temples more often, the naps that lasted too long, the moments of quiet that she had mistaken for teenage moodiness. She had been so busy keeping the house afloat, she hadn't seen what her daughter had been hiding in plain sight. She kept reading. "But you saved me anyway. Even when I was stubborn, even when I snapped at you, even when I gave you silence instead of truth. You never gave up. You fought for me harder than I fought for myself. I hope one day I'll be brave enough to tell you all this face to face. But just in case I'm not, I wanted to write it down. I want you to know that I'm sorry, and I'm thankful, and that I love you more than I ever knew a person could love another human being." The last line was underlined 3 times. "You are the reason I'm still breathing." Tears rolled down Sarah's face, dripping silently onto the wood grain of the table. She closed the journal gently, not out of shame or guilt, but reverence. She realized then that the journal wasn't just a diary, it was a mirror into Emily's private battle, one she had fought not just against illness but against fear, pride, and love twisted by pain. Sarah stood slowly, still holding the journal, and walked out into the yard. Emily was sitting under the old maple tree, Chance curled at her feet, a book in her lap. She looked up and smiled as Sarah approached. "Hey, Mom," she said brightly. Sarah sat down beside her, the journal resting in her hands. "I read it," she said softly. Emily froze, her eyes flickering to the ribboned cover. "I'm sorry," Sarah continued. "I didn't mean to. It was there, and something told me I needed to." Emily looked away, her fingers tightening on the grass. "I wrote that in case I didn't make it," she said after a long pause. "I didn't want to leave without telling you." Sarah reached over and took her daughter's hand. "You didn't leave," she whispered. "You stayed, and you're still here, and you told me everything I needed to know. Thank you." Emily looked at her mother with tearful eyes, then leaned her head onto her shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, the breeze rustling the leaves above, the sunlight filtering through like a soft blessing. The journal lay between them. Closed now, but its truth alive and understood. In its pages, pain had been given voice, and in that voice, they found healing. The days that followed passed with a quiet, steady rhythm that felt almost sacred. Sarah no longer tiptoed around Emily's emotions, nor did Emily keep her fears buried in silence. Something had shifted between them after the journal, like a window had been opened, letting in fresh air after years of holding it all in. Sarah began to speak more gently, not out of caution, but out of a new understanding. And Emily, though still healing in body and spirit, no longer carried the burden of pretending she was fine. One Wednesday morning, while folding laundry in the sunroom, Sarah heard Emily laugh, a true, unguarded laugh, from the living room. It wasn't forced or polite or tired. It was music. Sarah set down a towel and walked in to see her daughter. Watching an old sitcom, Chance curled up at her side like a furry guardian. Emily glanced up, saw her mother watching, and smiled without a trace of self-consciousness. That moment, simple as it was, struck Sarah in a way few things had. It reminded her that healing wasn't just about hospital discharges or test results. Healing was when your daughter could laugh again and mean it. Later that afternoon, Emily asked if they could go for a walk. Not a short stroll to the mailbox like she'd done weeks earlier, but a real walk around the neighborhood. Sarah hesitated, only a second before nodding. She laced up Emily's sneakers and wrapped a light jacket around her daughter's shoulders, even though the air was warm. Emily rolled her eyes in mock protest, but Sarah could see a glint of excitement beneath. They stepped outside together, like explorers setting off into new territory. The sidewalk stretched before them, familiar and yet changed. Every tree, every flower bed, every front porch they passed felt touched by memory. Neighbors waved from across the street. One even came over to say how happy she was to see Emily up and about. The genuine warmth in their faces reminded Sarah that they hadn't gone through this alone. Others had been watching, praying, hoping. As they rounded the bend toward the park, Emily paused. She looked up at the tall oaks, then over at the swing, set in the distance. "I used to be able to run from here to that bench without stopping," she said softly, pointing ahead. "I remember," Sarah replied. Emily took a breath, then looked at her mother with sudden determination. "I want to try again, not today, but soon." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Whenever you're ready, we'll do it together." They continued walking, slowly but purposefully, as if each step was stitching something invisible back together. That evening, after dinner, Emily brought out her paints. It had been nearly a year since she last picked up a brush. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway as Emily spread out her supplies across the dining table. There was something reverent in the way she moved, as though honoring a part of herself she thought she'd lost. She dipped the brush in water, then color, then pressed it gently against the canvas. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. Sarah didn't speak. She just stood there, silent and grateful, witnessing her daughter reclaim something sacred. When Emily finished, she stepped back and looked at her work. It wasn't perfect, not by technical standards, but it was alive. A swirl of gold and blue and soft purples, like a dream half remembered. Sarah stepped forward and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Emily smiled. "It's not what I used to paint," she said. But maybe that's the point. Days turned into weeks. Emily's strength returned in pieces, small victories that stacked together like stones in a foundation. She began journaling again, but now her entries were about the future. She painted more, even started helping out at the local art center once a week. Sarah watched all this with quiet pride, never pushing, never hurrying, just being present. One afternoon, as Sarah was organizing a kitchen drawer, she came across the envelope that had come from the hospital, the one with all of Emily's treatment records, scan results, bills. It had been sitting there, unopened, like a shadow she didn't want to face. But now, with her daughter upstairs humming along to a song on the radio, Sarah opened it. She sorted through the pages one by one, noting the dates, the procedures, the notes from doctors. But then, tucked near the back, was a handwritten note from Dr. Riley, the oncologist who had stood with them during the worst nights. It wasn't medical. It was personal. "Sarah," it began, "you were more than a mother during Emily's treatment. You were her anchor, her strength, her reason to believe. I've seen many parents over the years, but few with the fire and grace you showed. Emily's progress is nothing short of miraculous, but you helped create the space for that miracle to happen. I hope you know that." Sarah held the letter close, her heart swelling with something beyond gratitude, something like peace. Later that night, she and Emily sat outside on the porch swing, a warm breeze brushing against their faces. The stars blinked above like tiny promises. Emily rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "I'm not the same girl I was," she said quietly. Sarah nodded. "None of us are, and maybe that's okay." Emily was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I'm ready to talk to a group. Maybe at the hospital, other teens. Maybe I could help someone not feel so alone." Sarah's eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She only took her daughter's hand and held it. "You already are," she said. In that still night, with the scent of jasmine floating on the air and the gentle creak of the porch swing beneath them, mother and daughter sat side by side, not as survivor and caregiver, not as patient and protector, but simply as two women who had walked through fire and come out holding each other's hands. When Emily first walked through the doors of the children's hospital again, it wasn't as a patient. The fluorescent lights, the hum of machines behind glass, the pastel-colored murals on the walls, everything looked as she remembered, yet it all felt different now. Sarah stayed back near the entrance, letting Emily lead. She watched as her daughter paused by the elevator where, months ago, they'd once stood waiting in silence after learning the tumor had grown. Emily touched the wall gently, as if feeling the echo of that moment, then straightened her shoulders and walked forward. Her steps were slow but sure, not just in pace, but in purpose. The volunteer coordinator, a kind-eyed woman named Linda, met Emily with a warm smile and a clipboard. "You must be the young lady Dr. Riley told me about," she said. Emily smiled politely, but her hands trembled as she took the pen to sign her name. It wasn't nerves from the form, it was the weight of what this place had meant to her. She'd come here barely able to walk, skin pale, spirit dimmed, not knowing if she'd make it out again. But now, she was here by choice. That shift gave her courage. Linda led her to the adolescent therapy wing, where a small group of teens sat in a semicircle, their faces guarded but curious. A boy with dark circles under his eyes picked at a string on his hoodie. A girl with a scarf tied around her head stared blankly at the floor. Another, slightly older, looked up and offered a faint smile. Emily introduced herself. Her voice cracked a little at first, but she pressed on. "I'm Emily. I was here for a while. I had what you might have. And, I'm better now. Not perfect, but better." The kids looked at her differently after that. Not with awe or distance, but with something closer to recognition. Emily continued, telling them not the clinical story, but the real one. The nights she cried herself to sleep, The mornings she wished she didn't have to wake up, the loneliness that made her question if anyone could truly understand. But she also shared the turning points. Her mom reading to her late at night, Chance sleeping at her feet during every chemo session, the first time she was able to lift a paintbrush again. The room was silent when she finished, and then the girl with the scarf lifted her head. "Did you ever hate your friends for not visiting?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Emily nodded. "I did. I was angry. I felt forgotten. But I think they were scared, and I didn't know how to tell them what I needed either." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, clutching her knees to her chest. That conversation cracked something open, not just for the kids, but for Emily too. The more she shared, the more she realized she wasn't talking to them from some distant mountaintop of recovery. She was still climbing, still figuring it out, but now she wasn't doing it alone. Weeks passed, and Emily returned every Wednesday afternoon. Each visit deepened her sense of connection. She learned their names, Jade, Micah, Leo, and began to know their rhythms, their silences, their jokes. She brought art supplies one day, encouraging them to paint their emotions rather than explain them. What poured out was raw and beautiful and strange and honest. The walls of the therapy room slowly transformed into a gallery of survival. Sarah, watching from a respectful distance, could hardly believe the girl she saw walking through those halls was the same one she'd once cradled, afraid she might never see her grow up. Emily had found something even stronger than healing. She had found purpose. And in that purpose, she began to repair not just her own soul, but the hearts of others still on the battlefield. One day, after a particularly emotional session, Dr. Riley stopped Emily in the hallway. "You've done something remarkable." "Here," he said, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You give them hope they can believe in because it comes from someone who knows." Emily swallowed hard. "I don't always feel strong," she admitted. "You don't have to," he said. "Showing up when it's hard, that's strength." That night, Emily and Sarah sat together in the car outside their house. Neither moved to go inside just yet. The sky above them was painted with streaks of orange and violet, the last remnants of sunset. Emily looked over at her mother. "Do you ever think this happened for a reason?" she asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. "I don't believe everything happens for a reason," she said slowly. "But I believe we can make reason from what happens. And what you're doing now, that matters." Emily didn't reply right away. Instead, she rested her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about the scans or the treatments or the pain. She was thinking about Leo's smile when he finished his painting, about Jade's laughter when Emily made a bad pun, about Micah finally opening up about his dreams after months of silence. She was thinking about the power of connection, how something as simple as sitting beside someone in their darkness could be the most profound act of healing. Inside, Chance waited at the door, tail wagging, a soft whine in his throat. Emily opened the door and knelt beside him. "I'm okay," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his furry neck. "We're okay." And as Sarah turned off the car and followed them inside, she knew the light in her daughter's eyes wasn't just recovery, it was becoming. It was a warm spring afternoon when the school called to invite Emily back to speak. Sarah picked up the phone and smiled as the principal explained how inspired the students were by Emily's journey and how meaningful it would be to hear from someone their age who had lived through something so difficult, yet had come out stronger. When Sarah told Emily, the young woman froze for a moment, the phone still clutched in her hand. She looked out the window at the blooming dogwood tree that stood in their yard, its pink petals dancing in the breeze, and whispered, "I think I'm ready." The auditorium looked much smaller than Emily remembered. Rows of chairs lined the floor where she had once sat quietly in the middle row, notebook in hand, doodling while half listening to school announcements. Now she stood behind the microphone, staring at a sea of teenage faces, some familiar, some entirely new, all expectant. Her palms sweated slightly, and for a brief second, she was the scared girl again, hiding her pain behind a brave smile. But then she saw Mrs. Gaines, her old biology teacher, seated in the front row, eyes glistening with quiet pride. Sarah stood, in the back, holding her phone to record, and beside her sat Chance, freshly bathed, sporting a red ribbon around his neck. That sight alone gave Emily all the courage she needed. She began not with the diagnosis or the treatments, but with a simple memory. "There was a time," she said, "when a tiny bump showed up on my face. I thought it was nothing. My mom thought it was nothing. But sometimes the things we think are nothing turn out to be everything." The room quieted. She spoke of the fear, the doctors, the words no one wants to hear. She told them about the nights she couldn't sleep, the mornings when her bones ached, and the days she longed to feel normal again. But she also told them about the little moments that made her laugh, the people who surprised her with their kindness, and the dog who refused to leave her side. She told them how she had hated the mirror for what it showed her, but later came to see her reflection not as broken, but brave. A boy in the third row wiped at his eye, trying to be discreet. A girl near the back leaned forward, chin in hand, eyes wide and full of empathy. And as Emily's voice grew steadier, she spoke of healing, not just of the body, but of the heart. Illness doesn't just attack your cells, it attacks your joy, your hope, your trust in the world. And it takes time to rebuild that. But it's possible. She paused, scanning the room. And even if you never face something like I did, you're still going to have your own struggles. You'll feel lost, scared, unsure. But those moments, they don't define you. How you rise from them does. When she finished, the silence hung like a sacred hush before the first clap broke through, then another, and soon a thunder of applause filled the room. Emily didn't cry until she stepped off the stage and saw her mother, tears running freely, arms wide open. Sarah embraced her tightly, holding her as if letting go might wake her from a dream. "You were incredible," she whispered. "You always have been." That night, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, gazing at the framed photo on her nightstand, the one taken the day her last scan came back clear. She and Sarah stood side by side, arms around each other, with Chance sitting between them, his tongue lolling out happily. Behind them, the hospital entrance glowed in the sunlight. It looked like an ending, but in truth, it had been a beginning. Emily reached for her journal and opened to a fresh page. She began to write, not about pain, but about purpose. She wrote of the kids she met at the hospital, their dreams, their art, their courage. She wrote about her classmates, some of whom had come up after her talk to thank her, to say they felt seen. She wrote about her mom, who had made mistakes but had never stopped trying, never stopped loving her even when things got dark. And she wrote about herself, not as a victim, not even just as a survivor, but as someone still growing, still learning, still choosing to show up every single day. The days turned into weeks, and summer stretched across the town like a golden ribbon. Emily began volunteering more often, not only at the hospital but at local community centers, helping kids express themselves through storytelling and art. Sarah started attending support groups for parents of children with chronic illnesses, sharing her experiences and listening to others, offering the kind of comfort she once desperately needed. The two of them, once frayed and fragile, had become each other's safe haven, stitched together not just by blood, but by a bond deepened through adversity. One evening, while walking Chance through the neighborhood park, Emily turned to her mother and said, "You know, I used to wish none of it had ever happened. But now, I think I'm glad it did. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because it showed me who I am, who you are, what we're capable of." Sarah didn't speak right away. She just squeezed Emily's hand and nodded, her heart full. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the grass, the two of them walked on, mother and daughter, warrior and witness, two souls who had faced something terrifying and come out the other side, not untouched, but unbroken. The strange bump that once seemed so trivial had led them on a journey neither could have imagined. And now, with the past behind them and the future unwritten, they were ready to begin again. And so what began as a tiny bump turned into a journey of pain, growth, and unshakable love. A story that reminds us all to listen a little closer, care a little deeper, and never take a single moment for granted. Thank you so much for staying with us through this emotional story. Your time, your presence, and your open heart mean the world to us. If this story touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss the next powerful tale. Don't forget to like the video if you found it meaningful, and most importantly, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your feelings, or even your own story if you feel like sharing. Let's build a kind and caring community, one story at a time. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.